everyone, I'm going to be going over how to work with soft body and cloth physics. I have a few different collections that are set up for a few different versions of the simulation. This first collection is going to just be for very basic soft body. I have a ball, I have a box, and I have a plane to represent the ground. So I'm just going to start with the ball, and I'm going to turn on soft body physics. And if I play through from the start, it's just going to be hovering in space. Now, soft body physics are for objects that are going to deform when other forces act on them. Like you sit on a cushion and the cushion shifts. You press on the skin of your arm and that shifts. So soft bodies. Now, when I'm looking at the soft body settings, the hover effect is because of the goal setting. So if I uncheck that and play through, now gravity is taking over. Now it's just going through the ground plane because the ground plane isn't part of the simulation right now. I need to turn on collision physics so that it's recognized. Now when I play through, my ball hits the surface and then it's sort of collapsing and doing something unfortunate here. So I'm just going to go back to the start and I'm going to play around with some of the settings. Now there are a lot of soft body settings, but the edge settings in particular are going to be really helpful. Now, one of the most helpful ones here is going to be the bending setting. So depending on how much I want the ball to be sort of stiff, I can increase or decrease this bending number. And so now that's getting a little bit better. I can also turn on stiffness. And so as I play through, that's starting to be much better. Now, if I turn on soft body physics for the cube, again, it's just going to hover while goal is active unless I do some additional setup. So for now, I'm just going to uncheck that. Notice the ball and the cube are not interacting, but the cube is interacting with the plane. So actually, if you want soft bodies to interact with each other, they also need to have collision turned on. So now when I play through, they're actually interacting with each other. Now you may notice that the cube hasn't collapsed like the sphere did, and that is because of the amount of subdivision. The more subdivision this cube has, the more it can potentially deform. So if I add some subdivision and play through, you can see that the cube is deforming significantly. And so with the soft body setting here, maybe I'll turn on stiffness, maybe I'll increase the bending setting, probably want to do both of those. I might turn it all the way up or just partially, depending on the exact behavior that I want. Now back on frame one, I'm going to move my ball over to the side so they're not bouncing on top of each other. And over in the collision settings, we have a few things that have an impact on how bouncy the object is. So the amount of friction and the amount of damping should both have an impact on how bouncy something is. And so that would be something that I would adjust on both settings. And you may notice there's certainly plenty of other settings to experiment with, but for the most part, that should be plenty to get started with. All right. Next up, I'm just going to hide this collection and enable this one for push and pull. So I have a few different things that are set up here. First of all, I'm just going to turn on collision for the objects that are going to be interacting with each other, like that. And I'm going to have these two rings that are going to be set to soft body. Now, this one right here, I'm going to be experimenting with the pull setting. Something I want to mention is that I've added a little bit of animation to this scene ahead of time so that there's a shape key changing the shape of this object right here, and then this cube is sliding forward. All right, for both of these, I'm going to be turning off the goal setting, and here going to turn up bending. I'm going to go just to 5 and we'll see how that goes. I'm going to leave push at 0.5 and we'll see, just leaving this as the defaults for now, how exactly this is behaving. You can see now the ring is interacting with the shape as it stretches out. It's moving up to the top. Let's try lowering this. I'm going to put this to 0.1 and let's see how that behaves. So you can see that it's stretching a lot more when the object is sort of pulling it apart. And if I put this up to maybe 0.9 and play through, you can see that that is stretching a lot less. So when something is pulling the shape out of its sort of default size, the pull value determines, does this actually stretch or does it try to stay the same? So that's how pull works. All right, now push is, does this compress when other forces are acting on it? So again, I'm going to put the bending setting, I think I'm going to go up to 8 this time. I'm going to leave pull at the default, and for now I'll leave push at the default as well. But let's just see how that's behaving right now. Oh, you know what? There we go. I missed setting collision on for both of those. That's going to be behaving a lot better now. All right. So now we can see the default value for when this is pushing. I'm going to put this to 0.1. And you can see that that's really able to be pushed a lot. If I put this up to 0.9, it's really avoiding being pushed. Sometimes this can be interesting when you're combining it with plasticity. So the plasticity is the amount of permanent deform. So if I put this up maybe to 20, the shape stays deformed instead of going back. All right, so that is push and pull. So next up is this collection for soft body goals. So I have this sort of little squid which has some basic animation, just changing the position and rotation. So just a few keyframes there to make this interesting. I'm going to turn on soft body. Now this time I'm going to leave the goal setting checked. All it's going to do is do its animation, and then once they're no longer new keyframes, it just does that hover effect. Now I can actually have this be much more sophisticated and have different areas of the squid have different amounts of sort of the soft body physics happening because of this goal setting. So there are a couple ways I can do this. I'm going to head over into edit mode, and maybe I'm going to turn on wireframe, and I'm just going to use C to select a bunch of vertices with the brush. So maybe something like that. Back to solid. And I'm going to go to the vertex data, which is this little green triangle, and plus to create a group. I like to name my groups descriptively. I'm going to assign a weight of 1. And when I take a look in this weight paint mode, you can see that anything with a weight of 1 is red, anything without a weight is this dark blue. There's a little bit of a transition in between. I do want to mention you can do the weight painting by setting the weight to the vertices, or you can do it in this weight paint mode. And so there's a brush, and I can either add or subtract weight depending on what I have for the setting. So I can use the brush. I often like to use the gradient tool, particularly set to radial. And so this one, you click and drag, and it creates just a really nice, smooth gradient from one weight to the next. So you have a little bit more of a transition area, if that makes sense. And so depending on the strength that you're working with, it may take more or less time to work. I can do this the other direction as well, like maybe I want more of a gradual gradient going the other direction, but maybe something like that. I'm going to head back into object mode, and this on its own isn't going to do anything, but if I head back to my soft body settings and under goal, choose that vertex group. Now when I play through, you can see that it's using the vertices to help control what parts are stiff or not. Now, I do probably want to use some of my edge settings. I'm going to want to probably turn the amount of bending up so we can see that now the areas that don't have weight are behaving much more freely than the areas that do. I can experiment with different amounts of bending. I can experiment with different amounts of overall stiffness depending on how I want this to behave. So maybe something like that. Now, I'm personally not a huge fan of how this is sort of just wiggling in place pretty drastically when it gets to the end. And so that is something that if we go back over to the goal settings is due to the strengths here. I'm going to put the minimum up to 0.7, maybe 0.8, and when I play through, you can see that that behavior is looking much more interesting. And I can experiment with this minimum value, like maybe I actually want something that's a little bit lower. Maybe I want something that's a little bit higher. And I can experiment. And this is something that I can keyframe. So maybe at certain parts it is higher, at certain parts it is lower. And I can experiment with that depending on how things are going. So maybe at the start, I want it to be 0.5. And maybe I want it to stay at 0.5, maybe until frame 50. But maybe at this point, I want it to start transitioning to 0.7 or 0.8 by the time it gets to frame 70, where my other keyframe is. So I can change it and have it go back and forth, depending on what I like the look of. And I do want to mention, I'm just going to head over to the last keyframe here. If I put this all the way up to 1, the movement will actually completely stop at that point, and it'll stop behaving like a soft body. It's like it's just frozen. So if I did want to do that, I would be able to at that point. All right. So that's the basics of using the soft body goals so that you're able to really have more control over exactly what parts are behaving really strongly as soft body, or I guess the range of the soft body behavior across the different parts of the model. Now I do want to mention soft bodies do have a cache setting, so just like rigid body and just like fabric, we get to that. We can bake the simulation. You want to specify when it's starting, when it's ending. You can save the current cache that's already been played through. You can bake all dynamics if you're baking multiple types of physics at once, and you can delete the bakes if you need to get back to the start. Last up, we have cloth. All right, so I have a simple scene right now. I have Suzanne, which is just the monkey head, which is really good for testing things out. And I have a basic plane. I'm going to turn on cloth physics, and if I play through, the cloth is going to fall. It's not interacting with anything. So just like soft body, cloth physics, you need to enable collision when you want something to interact. And also similar to soft body, the amount of subdivision makes a huge difference. So right now, this is just a default plane, doesn't have any subdivision. So if I add some subdivision, this is going to start behaving a lot better. Now, the more subdivision you have, potentially the more accurate the fabric is going to be. Though always keep in mind, the more subdivision you add, the more processing that's happening, so the more issues you might have. So you can see that's behaving significantly better as well. All right, I'm just going to change to shade smooth, and that is going to start looking a little bit better. You can definitely see at different points, like you have this sort of jagged thing going on. So this might be something that might combine well with subdivision surface to just smooth that out a little bit further. So I recommend for fabric both shade smooth and a little bit of subdivision surface to really improve how that's behaving. Now, you may have noticed that when this gets to certain points, there's a little bit of clipping that's happening with Suzanne in the fabric, and that is due to the collision settings over here. So these work both for soft body and cloth on this area down here, and the inner and outer thickness have a really big impact on how well the cloth or the soft body interacts with the surface. You can see that that might have been a little bit too much, but now that clipping is not going to happen. And I can experiment with whatever looks the best as far as that goes. All right, now back to the cloth physics. From here, maybe I want this to be something that's a flag or a banner or a curtain and it's hanging in place. I can use Vertex Groups to do that. So I'm going to select just a couple of vertices, create a vertex group, and I like to name them descriptively, and just those two vertices I'm going to assign to a weight of 1. The rest all have a weight of 0. And if I head into weight paint, I'll see that there's just color in those corners where I gave it the weight. The rest is dark blue and doesn't have a weight. If I head back over to my cloth settings, there, I think under shape, I can create a pin or select a pin group, which is the vertex group. And now when I play through, the fabric is pinned from those points and is just going to be hanging. Now, something that works with all of the different types of physics, which I haven't mentioned so far, are the different forces. So from the add menu, we can add a variety of different forces. I usually just stick with the wind. And so the arrow here, well, the yellow arrow represents the direction that this is blowing. So I can encourage it to go whatever direction I want. Now, there are a lot of settings for the wind, and the strength is going to have a really big impact here. And sometimes you just need to increase it a drastic amount. Or maybe it's just not even aimed at the right place. So this is where maybe quad view might come in handy, maybe a little bit higher up. All right, let's see this. Now when I play through, not any obvious impact here. I'm going to turn this all the way up to 100 and play through. All right, now when your forces aren't acting on your object and you think that they should, like that is definitely angled so that it should really be impacting the fabric a lot. When that's happening, it might just be an issue of scale. So I'm going to be selecting both my fabric and my monkey, and back at the start, I'm just going to scale both of these up. And whenever I change the size, I should always apply it. So Control A to apply the change in scale. And so now when I go back to the start and play through, you can see that the wind is actually having an impact. So if the scale is too small, the physics often doesn't work properly. So with something like the wind, just making the objects longer, or sorry, just making the objects bigger is likely going to have quite an impact.